Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast diving into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, today here with Adjunct Professor of Law and Lecturer in Law, Menachem Rosensaft. Menachem, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It is such a pleasure. You reached out to me because you wanted to get across to our listeners the important legal and rhetorical distinction between genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes as well. So we are going to discuss all of that and much more after the break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Menachem Rosensaft. Menachem, I would like to just begin, before we roll into the very weighty matters, I would like to begin with discussing who is actually taking your classes on anti-Semitism and genocide, both at Cornell Law School and Columbia Law School right now.
Well, I've been teaching the course now for the past 15 years at Cornell and for 14 years at Columbia, and I've had a broad cross-section of students from around the world and from a broad range of different ethnicities, religious affiliation, ethnic affiliation, and the like. As an example, in my most recent class at Columbia this past spring, I had, I think, definitely 2, maybe 3 Jewish students, and the rest were from India, Italy, France, Australia, Rwanda, and other countries.
So having somebody from Rwanda in the class, I'm sure, made it a lot weightier in terms of the discussion period, but you yourself are no stranger to genocide, being the son of Holocaust survivor parents. So obviously this is something that is very close to your heart. And one would think that you would want to be very precise in the language. So let's begin by defining what is the actual legal definition of genocide.
Well, let's step back a little bit. The law of genocide in its jurisprudential infancy. As of the summer of 1945, no such criminal cause of action as either genocide or crimes against humanity existed. This was contrary to the prior international law under which countries, governments could do whatever they wanted without any kind of restraint or foreign interference within their own countries. There were some minor, very weak safeguards for populations under military occupation, under something called the Hague Convention of the late 19th and early 20th century, but those were very weak. In the aftermath of World War II, in the immediate aftermath, President Truman charged then Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, of the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert Jackson, with being the chief counsel on war crimes against Nazi war criminals. He then set around to draft basically a charter under which accused Nazi war criminals could be tried. And by that, I mean not individuals who could be tried in the countries where they committed the crimes, in France, in Poland, even in Germany, but in some context on a broader basis in an international forum. And for that, the International Military Tribunal that ended up being at Nuremberg was created. In so doing, they basically came up with 3 categories. The first being war crimes. That was not in dispute. That was an existing category. Then a brand new, unprecedented, and never to be used again charge called crimes against peace or waging aggressive war, which was basically under the impetus of countries like France, Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, that had been attacked by Nazi Germany. And this is we can get into it, but it's a different category. And then it was a question of what do you do with the atrocities? What do you do with the horrors that were committed against Jews, but not only against Jews? And this had been an ongoing process during World War II with a commission, an international commission on war crimes, going back and forth on this. Into this mix comes a man named Raphael Lemkin, who had written a book published in late 1944 on Nazi war crimes committed and the statutes that were enacted in various occupied countries. It was a book published by the Carnegie Foundation. And in that, he had come up with the concept of genocide, which was the concept of attempting to annihilate, exterminate a particular people. In that book, it was a broader, much more broadly defined context, or concept rather. Jackson was in contact with Lemkin. Lemkin contacted him very early on in, I think, May or June of 1945, sent him one of his articles, and Jackson brought him into his team that were preparing the charter for the International Military Tribunal. Lemkin was pushing very hard that the charge should be genocide. On a visit to London, Jackson met with the preeminent authority on international criminal law at the time, a professor at Cambridge called Hersch Lautenpacht. And Hersch Lautenpacht recommended very strongly to use instead of genocide the concept of crimes against humanity, which had already been considered back in the days of the Versailles negotiations. And that is what ultimately came into place. And that was the charge that was at Nuremberg, under which the defendants of the IMT were convicted. Lemkin then went on to push for the adoption of a convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide. This became a resolution that was unanimously passed in the December, I think, of 1945, and resulted in the Genocide Convention that was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. The reason I'm going through all of this is that the concept of genocide started off as an amorphous philosophical concept that Lemkin came up with, but it then was transformed by 1948 after numerous discussions and numerous debates within committees within the United Nations into a very specific, narrow concept, which required the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnical, religious, national, or racial group as such. That is the definition of genocide. And it's very narrow, very specific. If you go into the legal history underlying that resolution, it will tell you, and there are several thousand pages of it, of the so-called papier préparatoire, that will show you that, for example, political groups were initially intended to be covered by the convention, and they were also part of the original 1945 resolution. That was dropped. Cultural genocide was considered, and it was dropped. At one point, linguistic was brought in, probably to cover various French-speaking groups or Slavic-speaking groups, but that was dropped. So that at the end of 1948, this was the definition. And it is the definition under international law. The International Court of Justice in 2007, in the case brought by Bosnia and Herzegovina against Serbia and Montenegro, held specifically that it required something called a dolus specialis, a specific intent to destroy a group in order to be genocide. And that meant that if there was another reason for the acts in question, military, political, otherwise, and that was the reason for it, that was the intent, then it was not genocide. The intent had to be to destroy the group in question as such. And again, I know I'm maybe sounding like I'm splitting hairs, but it's important because if in the case of Gaza, the anticipation is that at the end of the conflict, whether it is next week or next year, there will be between 1,800,000 and 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza, then that, in my considered opinion, cannot be considered genocide because it goes counter to the intent to destroy the group. If, and I'm taking now at face value, the intent has been to eliminate Hamas as an existential threat, that is an intent that goes counter to having genocide as a goal of the war. But again, let me be very clear. This does not mean that atrocities, crimes may not have been committed that are not genocide. As I tell my students, two things. First, I do not believe that genocide is in any way a worse crime or more heinous crime than crimes against humanity. It is a different crime, but it is certainly the idea to say that that genocide is more heinous is simply wrong. And as I tell my students also, I have never heard of a single instance where any of the object of the unwanted attentions say to themselves, oh, it's not genocide. I'm only killed in a crime against humanity. I feel so much better. So we have to sort of remember that, and remember that not calling it genocide does not mean that we are absolving anyone from any responsibility. It just simply means that we should not be using a term which has become a totally incendiary term and is being thrown around for political and ideological reasons.
Right. Okay. So much to unpack there from what you said, of course. I just want to note, of course, that Raphael Lemkin, he was a Jew who grew up in Belarus, and he himself had this mission. He took on all sorts of international powers, bodies, professors, and he, in the end, did prevail with providing some kind of a definition for genocide, the one that is still used today, eventually. And I just want to ask you, do you think that creating this definition was a mistake? Because it sounds as though you're not completely wholly behind it.
No, I think creating the definition was perfectly reasonable. What I think in retrospect is that in 1946, a year after the end of the war, several months only after the conclusion of the International Military Tribunal, the UN could and probably would have enacted a convention for the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity, as defined in the IMT Charter, with genocide potentially as a subset of that definition, which would have made our collective lives a lot easier because then we would not have needed the specific intent requirement. Because then it would mean that a if a population has been enslaved, if a population is being subjected to atrocities, you do not need to also demonstrate what the specific rationale of the perpetrators was. But that's very much water under a lot of dams. There have been efforts over the past several decades to draft a convention for the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. It is going nowhere, extremely fast. It will not be enacted by the United Nations under present circumstances. And the same is true with, for example, a convention against ethnic cleansing. So effectively, we are stuck with a convention that was drafted in 1946 under the specter of World War II and the Holocaust. And from a legal perspective, that's what we have to deal with.
Right. You're talking about intent with the genocide definition, and obviously that needs to be proven. But it also seems as though genocide is talking about scope, meaning when you're talking about crimes against humanity, it could be one individual, two individual, three individual. But of course, with genocide, the whole, it's in the word. We're talking about the people, a whole people.
Well, not necessarily, because the convention is silent on how many individuals need to be subjected to the crime. And in fact, in Bosnia, in Srebrenica, in 1995, the actual casualties, the actual victims who were murdered by the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims who were murdered by Bosnian Serbs at Srebrenica, were somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000. And that was accompanied by the forced deportation from Srebrenica of some 25,000 plus women, children, and the elderly, and other kind of abuses. And the International Court of Justice held in 2007 that this indeed constituted genocide. And you have a number of commentaries, including probably one of the most authoritative commentaries on the convention was by a man named Nehemiah Robinson, who was at that point in 1949, head of the World Jewish Congress Institute of Jewish Affairs. And he very clearly said that the numbers required and the parameters are to be left to the courts, so that it's not a matter of scope necessarily. It's a matter of, and again, we get back to what was the intent. If the intent is to destroy a particular group, that makes it possible to come up with genocide. If that's not the intent, we're dealing with a different category.
I want to ask you one more zoom out question before we turn completely to this Gaza war. And this zoom out question is dealing with the confluence of all the different factors that made it possible for, again, this one little Jew, Raphael Lemkin, to take on all the powers and create this sea change in terms of the definition. We're talking about after World War II, after World War II, and it's not obviously the first war that ever happened on this earth, and it's not the first time that really terrible things have happened against one specific people. You and I both know in the Bible there are several different examples of this. So I wonder why exactly then was the time ripe to take on this issue?
In order to do that, we have to basically walk away from the concept that the Holocaust was somehow the worst or most heinous or most extreme manifestation of genocide. And I know that there are scholars who insist on that. I believe that they are wrong. We have had, as you point out, going back to Samuel ordering Saul in Book of Kings to kill all the Amalekites and their women, children, infants, horses, and camels, and Saul proceeding to do so and sparing the king of the Amalekite, which gets Samuel angry. Saul loses his throne, which is how we ended up with David. But that fits foursquare into the definition of genocide. We have the Roman wars against Carthage, which resulted in mass slaughters that were intended to obliterate that population. You had the crusade against the Khazars in southern France. And then, of course, fast forward, you had other incidents. You fast forward to the Armenians during the First World War at the hand of the Ottomans. But all of these have one thing very much in common. They were all perpetrated in situ, as it were. They were perpetrated in a particular location. And quite frankly, the Ottoman authorities did not care if there were Armenians living in France or in Greece or in the United States. They simply did not want them inside their own tent. The Hutus in Rwanda did not care if there were Tutsis living in Malawi or anywhere else. It was directed against the Tutsi population in Rwanda. The Holocaust was different in scope because it is the only instance of a genocide being perpetrated on a cross-national, multinational basis across all of Nazi-occupied and Nazi-dominated Europe, with Jews being transported from Belgium, from Greece, from France, from Germany, from different parts of Poland, to killing centers and being murdered there. So we're talking about a different in scope. But that different in scope also meant that you all of a sudden in 1945 had a lot of countries invested in seeing that these atrocities be brought to justice. Because it wasn't just German Jews who were killed by Germany. There were Polish Jews who were murdered. The Polish government had an interest. French Jews, the French government had an interest, etc., etc. And so that's why the post-World War II period was ripe for the United Nations to try to enact some kind of measure of making this kind of horror, this kind of cataclysm, impossible in the future. Of course, as we know, as a preventative measure, it didn't work. The existence of the convention did not prevent a genocide in Rwanda, and it did not prevent a genocide in Bosnia, and it did not prevent similar genocide or accused genocide in Myanmar or Darfur. But that's why it happened then. And Raphael Lemkin was one of these rare individuals who captured the, if you will, the spirit, the zeitgeist of that particular moment, and came up with a concept that answered the needs of the moment. Maybe not perfectly, but it did. And by the way, Lemkin did not come up with this concept in 1945 or 1944. He had been working on it since the 1920s when, as a law student, he became aware of the fact that the perpetrators of the Armenian murders were not brought to justice and that there was no mechanism under international law to bring them to justice.
Okay, Menachem, we're going to go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with Menachem Rosensaft. We're talking about genocide definition, legal definition of genocide. And now I want to take it to our current Gaza war. I have seen you quoted as saying that Hamas has genocidal ideology. Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by that?
Well, again, let's go back a little bit in history. I'm a lawyer and a historian. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly partitioned then British Mandatory Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, for various reasons that are not relevant to this discussion. At that point, as we know, the Jewish side, the Yishuv, accepted the partition. The totality of Arab countries at the time did not, resulting in the Israel War of Independence, resulting in the conditions we had until 1967. Then, with the Six-Day War, Israeli reach expanded to include Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And we end up with an effective stalemate in which what had then become the representative of the Palestinians living on the West Bank and in Gaza, as represented by the Palestine Liberation Organization, did not recognize the existence of Israel. That changed in 1988 when the PLO effectively changed its orientation and was willing in a succession of acts, one of which I participated in Stockholm, to ended up recognizing Israel and being willing to engage in a political process. At that point, Hamas comes into being with a charter which basically demands the removal from the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean of all Jews, or at least of all Jews who had not been there prior to World War I. And this is Hamas's ongoing intention, and that was part of its motivation on October 7th. It was to destroy, remove the Jewish presence from, again, the state of not just the West Bank or Gaza, but also the territory of the state of Israel. That, to me, evidences genocidal intent. I don't go as far as to say that October 7th was itself an act of genocide, because I do not believe that it was Hamas's intention with that to destroy all of Israel or the Jewish presence of Israel. They might have liked to, but that's a different story. But by that attack, they did not target Jews in Tel Aviv. They did not target Jews in Jerusalem. They certainly didn't target Jews in Haifa. So we have to be careful. But Hamas does have a genocidal intent, which again translates, as I've also said, into a very rational and legitimate reaction from Israel, which was, in the aftermath of October 7th, to remove the possibility of a repeat performance of October 7th, and therefore to remove Hamas as a potentially existential threat against the existence of the State of Israel and the safety of its population. That, to me, negates the intent required for genocide.
In the aftermath of October 7th, there was a lot of inflamed rhetoric, some of which continues until today in the halls of the Knesset and outside, with some of Israel's top leadership, meaning I'm talking about Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. I'm talking about the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. But not only, in fact, after October 7th, an idea was floated on Israeli radio that a nuclear bomb should just be set off in Gaza. That is an Israeli politician floating that idea. And of course, all of this is coming to haunt Israel when it comes to the case at the International Court of Justice, which was brought by South Africa in December 2023. So all of this to some could indicate intent as well. Let's take that and add one more thing to it before you respond, which is, of course, the idea from U.S. President Donald Trump to create a Gaza Riviera. I mean, that is obviously the slang of this plan, which would include moving out en masse much of the Gaza population, if not all of it. Would not those two things together indicate some kind of genocidal intent as well?
Well, let's use them separately. First of all, I think the idea of a Gaza Riviera, that concept lasted for about 5 minutes and has not been revived since. People come up with all kinds of ideas and thoughts, and unless and until they become policy or become, in fact, implemented, one has to be very careful to suggest that they are part of a genocidal scheme. That gets us back to a lot of the statements that were made in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. There was understandable rhetoric on the part of Israeli leaders. It was reflecting the anguish, the pain of the moment, the horror at what happened, the horror at seeing the way the hostages were both taken captive and then greeted when they were dragged into populated areas of Gaza, so that you end up with inflamed rhetoric. Inflamed rhetoric in and of itself cannot be the source of a genocide cause of action. And of course, the South African case as presented did not take the various quotes necessarily in context. There was rhetoric by President Herzog, for instance, that was used without mentioning that he also said in the same speech that there would be no targeting of innocent civilians, that humanitarian law needs to be abided by, and the like. And the same thing with various others. So we have to be careful. Now, when it comes to the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others, yes, they are, in fact, a serious danger. And if they were in control of the government, that would change the situation. But they are not. And even Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very careful in his various, shall we say, political maneuverings to hang on to office and to not antagonize Smotrich and Ben-Gvir further than absolutely necessary, not to make the most outrageous statement that would provide fodder to a claim of genocide. But I'm not suggesting for a moment that these comments are not very troubling, that they are not raised legitimately. There is an answer to them. And again, we come back to what is the end result. If, for example, there were, in fact, a policy of starving the Palestinian population of Gaza, that would be a serious component of a genocide charge. If, on the other hand, efforts are being made by the Israel government to bring humanitarian aid into Gaza, that counteracts such a charge, which doesn't mean that there weren't instances when humanitarian aid was withheld. It doesn't mean that you don't have serious issues. And it doesn't mean, and let me step away for a moment from the legal concept. We cannot, as Jews and as human beings, ignore the humanitarian catastrophe that is taking place in Gaza. You have an entire population that is under siege, that is suffering from malnutrition and starvation to a greater or lesser extent. that is suffering from an absence of medical care, which is evidenced by the body bags containing children that we have seen over the past 2 years. So we have to maintain empathy, compassion, and put a focus on how to end the cycle of violence rather than just engage in continuous argument as to why one side is right, why the other is right. You have enough grievances on both the Israeli side with October 7th and previous terrorist attacks on the one side, the Palestinian side with the past 2 years almost of a war on the other, that you now have two populations that effectively hate each other. And you have, at the moment, no leaders on either side who are willing to take any steps to try to change that dynamic. With the possible exception of President Herzog, who, as president of the State of Israel, is exuding moderation and an insistence of abiding by humanitarian principles, there is no one within the Israel government who is expressing any kind of empathy or concern for the plight of the Palestinians, and certainly not in Hamas, and not in the present makeup of the Palestinian Authority do we have anybody who is on the Palestinian side who is willing to say, well, the Israelis do have a point, and how do we get out of there? We don't have the likes of Ehud Olmert or Tzipi Livni or Ehud Barak who were prepared to engage with Palestinian leaders. And we need Palestinian leaders who are going to be prepared to say, okay, how do we fix this going toward the future? And let me add one other point. What is very, very dangerous, in my opinion, is for Mr. Netanyahu and others to characterize as anti-Semitic any initiative by any national leader, whether it is Emmanuel Macron or the Prime Minister of Australia, in the direction of the Palestinians. Supporting the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, an eventual self-determination, is not in and of itself an act of anti-Semitism. And we should not allow Prime Minister Netanyahu and others to characterize them as such.
It is very curious timing, however, to give a Palestinian state to a people who committed, as you said, not genocide, but a great act of war. And of course, they're continuing to hold the Israeli hostages and making absolutely no noises, even that they would not kill all the Jews from the river to the sea. So it is very curious timing to do it right now.
I agree with you, and I'm not suggesting that there should, and certainly as someone who has been an active supporter of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process for over 40 years, and a sometime participant in that process, I'm not suggesting that there should be a Palestinian state recognized now or next week or next month or next year. But there needs to be a process under which somehow a resolution to the conflict can become at least feasible, with individuals on both sides talking in that direction. And it won't happen if you have a refusal on the part of Israeli leaders to talk to Palestinians and vice versa. We need to get back to the days that were under Yitzhak Rabin, under Shimon Peres, under Arik Sharon, Olmert, Barak, where there was a dialogue, not necessarily a productive dialogue. Offers that were made by both Barak and Olmert were refused, as we know, by Arafat and by the Palestinian Authority. But we still have to look at what are the options. The options of a perpetual domination of 5 million plus Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza by Israel with no possibility of eventual self-determination is simply not going to fly any more than the Hamas-Iran desire to remove Israel as a Jewish state from the face of the Middle East. And I would suggest that we need to be very, very careful. I agree that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, has become a slogan of not just anti-Israel and anti-Zionist rhetoric, but it has become a slogan of anti-Semitic demonstrators around the globe. Having said that, let us not forget that the policy, the ideology of the Likud until quite recently was for dominance by a Jewish dominance for the entire territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And there are voices within the present government that are repeating that Israel should have a permanent Jewish dominance over those territories. That provides a problem. Once upon a time, Abba Eban, the legendary Israeli foreign minister during the latter half of the 20th century, said very correctly that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a conflict between right and wrong, but it's a conflict between two rights. And somewhere, somehow, there has to be an effort to try and work this one out in a way that is equitable to both, whether it is an Alon plan, whether it is a Rabin plan, whether it is somebody else's plan. But there has to be some way of getting out of it, because the alternative, by the way, is not just extremely dangerous for Israelis and Palestinians and their future, but it does bring into play the Jewish communities around the world. They are affected. Diaspora Jews are affected by what is happening in Israel. I'm afraid that the present government is not just alienating Israelis who don't agree with it. They are alienating Jews around the world who don't agree with them from remaining part of the support for Israel.
As an Israeli, I appreciate hearing all of your thoughts and your pain, because you are very attached to Israel. I can hear it. I just want to mention something. We've gone on way too long, but this is something that is driving me a little bit crazy, and I have to just express it as well. You are pushing for some kind of peace process and for leaders such as Barak, Olmert, Tzipi Livni, etc. But I think it's really, really important to remind everyone that Barak and Olmert especially had a hugely maximalist vision of giving much land to the Palestinian Authority, and they were rejected. Just as in the year 2000, there was a rejection from Yasser Arafat, and Israeli leadership over and over and over again have come up with these amazing compromises and have been turned down throughout the years. We don't need to go down this path, but it is something that I really wanted to express, because it's interesting to me that American Jews such as yourself and American Jewish leadership such as Reform leadership are very stuck on the two-state solution still. But you have to remember that there's a reason why it never has worked out until now, after being refused again and again and again. And Israel is just not in that mindset right now.
I appreciate everything you say, and I don't disagree with the historical fact that you mentioned. The problem remains that unless and until someone comes up with an viable alternative to a two-state solution, we are living in a global world. In 1967, in July of 1967, weeks after the end of the Six-Day War, the then president of the World Jewish Congress and the World Zionist Organization, Nahum Goldman, said, and I was there Israel cannot prevail as a Sparta of the Middle East. This is a reality that we need to deal with. So if it's not a two-state solution, let someone come up with an alternative. Let someone come up with a proposal that will actually gain adherence. Because if it is simply a kind of Masada, like we are going to stand on our own against the world, I'd like to remind ourselves, maybe that's the end of this conversation, that none of us, not a single Jew today, is a descendant of the fighters of Masada. They, according to Josephus at least, were all killed. We are all physical and ideological descendants of Yochanan ben Zakkai and those who went to Yavne and were looking for a new alternative.
Menachem, that's a great way to end this conversation, and I so appreciate all of your insight. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.